This is a last call to get in on early bird pricing for my online yoga teacher training. If you register before October 1st, you can get 50% off. And I've been getting a number of inquiries from listeners. Seems like the most common questions are about time commitments. People have very busy lives, and they're wondering what the requirements are, how many live Zoom meetings they need to attend. And in all of my previous mentions, I've always said the program is co-creative. It doesn't have arbitrary hoops that you need to jump through, and that it fits to you. And that's what I meant, that there aren't a set number of meetings that you need to come to. Some people have a lot of time and they like to come to a lot of Zoom meetings. Some people like to work more independently and do not want to be in Zoom meetings. Some people have stretches of time where they're able to come to meetings, and then other times when they're not. Everything's on replay, and it's a year-long program, so a lot of life happens in a year. And I guess it's confusing. I guess it's unusual that there aren't like this set thing that you have to follow to. But to me, that really goes to these deeply ingrained ideas we have about yoga teacher training. And all I'm doing is getting back to the way that myself and my teachers learned yoga. We did not learn yoga and become teachers following along an hours-based curriculum in a linear progression. It happened in an organic way that unfolded over time. So I've created a guideline, a structure for us to go off of. But it's not something that's required or that you have to follow. It's something that you utilize in the way that makes the most sense for you. So I am starting a new group in January, and if you are feeling inspired to a deeper study into yoga, or you're interested in developing a teaching practice, or you're already a teacher and you're looking for some new perspective, then I encourage you to check out my online yoga teacher training program. And if you register before October 1st, you can get 50% off. To learn more and register, go to jbrownyoga.com/training. That's jbrownyoga.com/training. All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you, fair listener. I hope this moment finds you well, and I appreciate you tuning in. I don't want to jinx it, but I've been doing okay. I had a good week. I mean, there was one day that was not good, but on the whole, things have been better. If you've been around, you know I was having a rough time of it, but it feels like it's kind of leveled out, and I'm going to just knock on a little wood there, but I feel like this turn of season from summer to fall has been suiting me well. And I just hope that whoever you are is doing all right too. Maybe things have been going okay for you. Also, I think it was a few weeks ago, I don't think it was last week, maybe the week before, I mentioned something about feeling like things were starting to happen again in the yoga world. Well, I've continued to observe this. I've just seen some things that people are putting out and some conversations I've been having, including today's conversation with Catherine Annis, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I'm really getting this sense that something's percolating. And it's not like it was before. There's something very different happening right now than was happening before everything fell apart. And from what I can see, in many respects, it's a better direction. I mean, it's not what we might have thought or not what we were doing before, and that's a good thing in my mind, but it definitely seems like there's some new things about, and I know I'm being kind of vague because I don't know exactly how to put words to it. although I'm going to do that today some in my conversation with Catherine, I just feel like there's a momentum building in pockets of the yoga world. And I'm wondering if you listening to this is having that feeling. Is that true for you in your own life? Are you feeling inspired to start a new class? Or are you going to the center again? Or are you doing a workshop for the first time in a long time like I just did? I'm kind of curious if you're listening to this and you feel like things have been percolating or you've been observing some things happening, send me a note. I would really love to hear about what's going on out there with other people, and if it's just wishful thinking on my part or there really is something happening. I do know that there has been this evolution happening in the way that people are teaching. I've been talking about this pedagogy shift that's been taking place, and I'm more and more convinced that it's not just wishful thinking on my part, that it's really happening. And that's certainly what I'm talking about today with Catherine Annis. Catherine reached out to me. She's a teacher in the UK. She's been doing yoga teacher training for many years at Tri Yoga. And she's a Vonda Scaravelli-inspired teacher. So if you've been around, you know I've been very interested in talking about Vonda and in more somatic approaches and the use of form within that and all these conversations I've been having. Well, Catherine and I connected and had like a mind meld on all of this stuff. And it was really wonderful, very affirming and clarifying to connect with her. I'm very glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I do want to express some gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Today, I specifically want to thank Stephanie Cockrell and Karina Clark. Shout out to you, Stephanie and Karina. Really appreciate you supporting the show with your subscription. And if you're new around here, having a podcast premium subscription is not just about supporting the show. It's also about accessing the full archives, which is quite extensive at this point. So if you want to gain access to that archive or you just want to support the show, becoming a podcast premium subscriber is the way that you do it. It's choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. And if you don't have any money and you want to listen to an old episode, then you just email us and we will definitely give you a free account. But if you have even just a little something to give, it makes a difference. It's the way that independent media like this survives, and we're incredibly grateful to everyone who makes that gesture. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find any of my other stuff, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think I'm just going to leave it there. As usual, I will touch base with you on the other side, but for now, let's just go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Catherine Annis. Hello?
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Catherine.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you too. I'm really happy that we got this time.
Yes. And I know you've listened to this show, but just to say I am recording, and if it's okay, I'd like to think of us having just begun.
We have.
Wonderful. And I have to say I'm smiling to myself because I would say the large majority, if not almost everyone who comes on this show, particularly like I don't know how to say it, and I hope you take this the right way, like a senior teacher, someone who's been around for a long time, they're always right on time. They're always right on time. Like, me, like with my meetings, whatever, at the same time, I count 30 seconds at this one point and I start it, like sort of, I think because yoga teachers, they have to be on time. It's like their job. You can't be late to your class, right?
It wouldn't be popular.
That's right. You can't be late. So anyways, My compliments for your punctuality, and again, nice to meet you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. And, it's I think this continues to be a thread for me. I know, not too long ago, I was sort of talking about Vonda Scaravelli on the show, and I know you're greatly inspired and aligned by her teachings. So I think there's some conversation for us there. I'm also just curious because it seems like we both also had that kind of progression through other systems and then landing there. And I always like having that conversation to compare notes on that, because I do think there's been some pedagogical shifts just happening at large in the yoga community. So I'm interested in that. But before we get to all of that, I have to ask you about something that's kind of seemingly, random and unrelated, but you mentioned in your email to me that you were on the Benny Hill show. And when you mentioned that, I immediately flashed back to when I was a young boy and my brother secretly showing me the Benny Hill show so my parents wouldn't know that he was showing me. And I actually went back on YouTube to look at some clips, and I was like, oh my God, Benny Hill was this kind of racy show. And I guess in today's sensibilities, very not politically correct, but I have to ask you, how did you end up on the Benny Hill show, and what was that like?
Okay. Hands up. I was trying to get your attention, and I thought, I thought, well, and it's something that for years I didn't talk about, because I felt that it didn't fit with the kind of image of me as serious yoga teacher.
Yeah. Only so much as you feel comfortable to talk about it. I didn't mean to call you out if it wasn't something you wanted to talk about, but you mentioned in the email, and I had this childhood trigger. I'm like, oh my God, Benny Hill. So, if you're okay to talk about it, I am curious.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. And part of me did mention it because also I feel like I need to out myself.
Okay.
Yeah, I was 19. I was a professional dancer. I got the opportunity to audition for Benny, and I got the job, and I was on the show for, I suppose about a year, which now, I still get, it's still aired, because what they do is they film a whole hour-long show, and then they clip it all up into the different bits and do the best ofs. You've seen them. But I was really young, and it's incredibly sexist. But it was a good job for me as a beginning, as a young dancer, because there was a lot of exposure. You got to meet the press a lot, and yeah.
I know. And it was a different time. I saw some interviews with other Hills Angels, and they talked about it. And a lot of them didn't even view it as sexist from their viewpoints. But I could see, like I said, from today's sensibility, I think there has been, I don't know if we want to call it growth or evolution of the way that we, men and women, are respecting each other. I know I don't treat my wife in the same way my dad treated my mom.
I think it was all about Benny's love of seaside humor.
Yeah.
Sort of girls in bikinis and kiss me quick hats and all of that. And he just poured that into and he liked girls, What can I say?
Yeah. But in the end, when you look back on it, if we took away all whatever cultural stuff that we would have to look at it through nowadays, was it a bad experience for you, or is it a positive experience for you?
Oh, that's a toughie. It was a mixed experience.
Okay.
There were it was a fantastic experience in terms of it being a very high profile TV show, being very popular. There were some elements of it that were less nourishing.
You only were there for a year. It sounds like you didn't stay for very long.
I'm not going to go there.
Okay, fair enough.
It didn't last.
I understand.
But it was a mixed experience. So there was lots of good about it, and there was some things that were uncomfortable.
Got you. That's it. Because it's interesting to hear, because again, sometimes people are like, oh, it was just a different time. And it was a different time. But at the same time, there's reasons why things have changed. You know?
There are, yeah. And I'm glad for those changes. And it's really interesting because you talked about how the teaching of yoga has changed as well.
Well, there's a similar phenomena that's taken place in terms of what was sort of considered acceptable, generally speaking, back even when I started in the 90s, in the early 90s, sort of teacher-student dynamic and the whole kind of like somatic dominance of the teacher as kind of telling everyone exactly what to do with their bodies or whatever. That was very much in place, you know, and that has changed. Like, that's what I'm kind of, seems like we've both observed that.
It's been, I mean, my teaching has changed radically since I started teaching, and just classroom dynamics have changed so much. Teachers have really woken up to all kinds of things. I mean, the whole question of touch, of adjustments, and that was all happening even before the Me Too movement. Right. We were seeing changes, and then we got the Me Too, and then we got COVID, and now it's like, oh, you know.
Yeah, it's true. Well, we can get to that. I mean, even just what you're saying, like before even the Me Too, I just remember getting a bad Yelp review because someone didn't like the way I touched them without asking first. And I was like, what? And then I just started asking everybody after that, you know, like, I don't want to do that. So there was stuff happening even before that whole wave that came through the yoga world.
Yeah.
But I guess I am curious first to kind of go back a little bit. I know I read, you mentioned that, you know, your first exposure to yoga was your mom in the 70s. And I guess I'm just kind of curious, was your mom a teacher proper, or was she just practicing and you saw her doing in the living room?
No,
was your mom a hippie in the 70s? How do you get exposed in the 70s?
No, she wasn't a hippie. She was just always really interested in movement. And she used to go to Keep Fit, you know, when you used to wear the nylon leotards. Well, maybe you didn't, but...
Yes, I remember.
You remember.
They still had them in the 80s when I was growing up, right? They were different in the 70s, but they had like a version in the 80s, right?
Yeah. So Keep Fit in church halls, and then that changed to yoga. And she used to take me along to her yoga classes. And because I was at dance school at the time, you know, the physical postures were not particularly difficult for me with my dancers' flexibility and everything. But what was really fantastic was the teacher used to talk a lot about shunyata, about stilling the mind and turning your mind into a blank screen. And that hooked me totally. You know, I was 13, I think. And I just loved that. It really held me. So whenever I was back from school on holiday, I used to go with my mom to yoga because we didn't have it at school. And then there was a break after I left school and I worked professionally for a bit. And then I remembered it when my grandmother died. And I'd found this class locally in a church hall, really beautiful church hall. And I used to go along there 3-4 times a week. And it was a Shivananda, kind of Shivananda approach, with this teacher, Fausto, and he used to cook us food, vegetarian dinners.
Prasad, he'd bring prasad.
Well, not just prasad. He used to actually, we used to have like a soup and then a stir fry and then a pudding. It was like proper full on dinner. So we used to do 2 hours of class, and then we used to sit down on the floor and somebody used to come and cook us the food, and we used to stay and eat, and he used to teach us about whatever he wanted to teach us about. So it was a whole evening thing, and I used to do that 3 times a week for several years. So,
I mean, it's so interesting. It's so interesting. I've often talked about how, because that's exactly right. I, again, didn't really come to yoga until the early 90s, but there was still the flavor of what you're just saying, where yoga centers were still trying to create like a living room for you to be in. And it was really more about these other kind of aspects of practice in terms of stilling your mind, as you say, or I was like, it was inner peace, like advanced was inner peace, instead of it all being about poses. And then that does change.
It does change. No, I was really interested in the whole pranayama. I used to really like, the thing about Shivananda is, you do a pose and then you lie down for a bit.
Yeah, the shavasana in between, right?
The shavasana in between. I used to go for the shavasana in between. Literally, that used to be my reason for going, was the shavasana in between. And I still love that bit.
I mean, it's interesting because I've often talked about, like, there's kind of a patterning and a practice ritual, right? So for a long time, it was just like, go, 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 until you collapse in shavasana at the end, right? And that's kind of like a burnout pattern for me in my life. But I developed another pattern, which is like, do some focused, attentive engagement, and then stop and relinquish the effort from, and like to have the stops in between. Like, I remember in the early days, I always thought Shivananda was boring because you always had to do the shavasanas in between and you didn't get any flow going. But I found a way of having a more vinyasa kind of practice, but just putting stops in there. The same kind of principle is still there, that the fixing and then the releasing of your attention as well seems important. So that you said you were there for the shavasanas in between kind of relates to something about the stilling of the mind, it seems to me.
And I was really interested much later, and I've only just really now, since we've been talking, put the two together. I did some Feldenkrais much, 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 much later. And part of that was always stop, notice, how have you integrated?
Right.
So you do something and then pause.
Right.
The shavasana in between. And I'm thinking back that, that's really what we were doing in the shavasanas, was sensing change. And I think that's what's really important now. And what I try and always incorporate in my classes is that space for noticing.
Right. And that is sort of the kind of the newer, more somatic, for lack of a word to use, kind of sensibility. But I guess I still want to get there, because we were talking about having dinner with your teacher 3 times a week, but there's a whole period in there where the wave of yoga hits. And I wonder sometimes, I think it might have hit a little later in the UK or whatever than it did here, depending. I'm not sure. But at some point, it certainly seems like Iyengar and Ashtanga and these other kind of, I don't know, flashier, more charismatic styles, if you will, that don't have a rest in between each pose. Quite the opposite. They kind of became very popular. And I certainly studied them, and I know you did too. So when do you start to explore other approaches as well?
So I think what happened was, when I was working with Fausto, there was an Iyengar center, but it was too far away for me to travel there in London. And that was and there was the Shivananda down in Putney, but that again was too far away for me to go. And anyway, and we were slightly behind you in the States in that you had the whole fitness.
Yeah, because Ashtanga came in, and then it was in the gyms, and then it was like power yoga took off.
And our wave of fitness and health clubs came in a bit later. And when they started coming in, of course, they started filling up their classes with various different modalities. And then I got exposed to Ashtanga and Iyengar. And I liked Iyengar. I did Ashtanga for about a year, but I just found it too much like hard work. I missed my Shavasana.
Yes, it's really hard work. And it sort of had that, like, I don't know how it was presented to you, or as much as they would try to say otherwise, it was always like, who's going to get to the next past primary? Like, are you going to finish primary? It was like they did this, like, because it was kind of such a set system, and there was like the 7, and there was, you know, it seemed like a achievement orientedness to it that I wanted to get away from. But
I think for me, hands up, I didn't really know. I didn't get into it enough to know that there was a primary and a secondary. I just used to go to this class called Ashtanga, and I just knew it was really hard work. And I used to stand up in Trikonasana and go, oh my God, I'm going to fall over. I'm so dizzy. But I used to like the challenge of it, but it didn't really grip me in the way that this other teacher did. I used to go to this other teacher, and she wasn't doing Iyengar and she wasn't doing Ashtanga, and I really didn't know what she was doing. But whatever it was, she was stopping me from going into poses. I was being like, okay, we're doing elbow dog. Heave. Yeah. And she would go, no, stop, Catherine, back off, back off, back off. And it made me really get into the poses in quite a different way. It just felt much deeper. And gradually over the years, I stopped going to the other classes and I just focused on this one class because I felt that or this one teacher, because I felt that was what was really supporting me in, the only word that came to mind really was depth. It felt like I was getting into something, whereas with the others, I felt a bit like I was skipping across the top. And I liked Iyengar because it was technical, but it lacked the kind of, it lacked the spirituality. And I don't like that word. But
you can like that word. Why don't you like that word? It's okay. You can say spirituality.
It always feels like if I say, "Oh, my class is a spiritual man."
I know, but like I know what you meant because our younger teachers didn't talk about consciousness or perception or even stilling the mind necessarily. Although sometimes it'd be oblique references, but mostly it was about alignment. I mean, let's be honest about it.
Yeah, exactly. And quietly, in my own kind of self, it was the coming into the quiet space, that interoception, interiority, that
Shavasana in between.
Yeah, that'll do. That place, that was what was so valuable. And that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. That's what I enjoyed experiencing. And with this kind of slower, less, it was harder work, I have to say. My legs would burn because she would say, no, don't go so quickly. Come up slowly. And so, you work slowly and your legs, well, don't know about yours, but my legs go, oh, hello. Requires more control, more coordination. Just you ease yourself into it and you can kind of, you feel your whole body moving. And of course that engages your mind and then you reach that quiet place.
Well, I have to tell you, it's so interesting. I mean, I recorded another podcast earlier today. I rarely do 2 in one day, but it just happened like that today. And the one that I did earlier today is all about hypermobility syndromes. I don't know if you know about that, not just hypermobility, but the syndromes. And when you describe that teacher saying, no, let's come back and let's move slower and simpler. And the challenge of that as kind of a way of kind of bringing a certain kind of stability to your system. Like that's been my experience too. There's a similarity between us, I think, in that regard. And all kinds of other kind of pain issues that sometimes you have to deal with that seem to move here and move there, and they're very hard to diagnose. But it's interesting how I think at some point when you get over it being about poses where you're like, okay, I can do poses, or I don't care about doing poses anymore for one reason or another. But yoga practice becomes about something else, this sensing or feeling, and moving slower and simpler is kind of really fundamental to developing that kind of sensitivity or something.
Yeah, because it gives me time to really listen in, to really notice and to send my mind into all the disparate bits and bobs, all the ends of my limbs, deep into the tissues, close to the bone, around within the organs, wherever it is I'm kind of focusing that day. It gives me a chance to really notice and sense into where I might be holding tension, unnecessary tension, and letting that go. And then you feel that the breath is easier and your whole body kind of goes, it's like a big sigh, another shavasana in between.
Yeah. So does this teacher, who was the one who kind of modeled for you the possibility that there was another way to work in your asana practice, is that how you found your way to Vanda?
Yeah. I mean, I never worked with Vanda, but she had, I think, worked with Vanda. I think. I know she'd worked with Diane Long, and through her name was Alex Gray, just to give her absolutely credit. She also led me sort of circuitously to John Stirk, who became my teacher for, still is really. So I don't know.
I've never heard of John before. Is he kind of in the Vanda line? Is that the deal?
He's totally amazing. John is an osteopath. He worked with R.D. Lang. He also worked with Vanda, and he taught just up the road from me in the church. And somebody said to me, "Oh, you really would like John. You should ring him up and go to his class." So I phoned him up and I said, "Oh, hi, John. I'm Catherine, and so-and-so and so-and-so have told me that I should really call you and come to your class." And he said, "Why? Why do you want to come?" And it was like, I thought, oh, you're trying to put me off. So I felt I really had to convince him to let me come. He said, what is it about my class that you think would help you? So I said, well, because I'm looking for some more depth in my practice, and I really I feel like I'm still skipping along the surface and I want to get into it. Well, come along and see. I don't make any promises. Come along and see. And we've been working together ever since. And he's been an amazingly generous mentor to me. I mean, I don't still regularly go to his classes because what I said to him a while ago was, John, you're in my head and you're in my cells, and I feel like I need to be alone for a bit, really listening to myself. And now I've moved out of London completely. So now I'm living in the middle of the countryside in Exmoor, which is a kind of a wild and rural place.
Well, I think that happens with teachers that you study with for a very long time. Like at some point, I think you sometimes can learn what that teacher is teaching and even kind of become a teacher in your own right sometimes. And then there's a point where it's not that important for you to be in class, or if you do, it's just to go hang out and be together, because you've kind of learned what you needed to learn from that teacher. And then I think some teachers are better at wanting that to happen as opposed to like trying to keep someone like kind of at a certain relationship, And it's also interesting. I just want to point out to listeners, because this is something I've talked a lot about, even in terms of the difference between a group yoga class context and kind of like a one-to-one context and a teacher-student relationship. And when you talk about calling up John and having to convince him to let you come to class, that's just such a completely different dynamic than like the I pay, now give me the yoga and I want the good kind, so that dynamic that a lot of yoga teachers came into being yoga teachers, where it was the drop-in group yoga class context, where that is the feeling that you were getting from people coming in the room. That's totally different than you're coming into meeting this teacher where you're like, please, I want to learn from you. And him being like, I make no promises, come if you want. Like, that's a totally different starting point.
Yeah. And I've have been to other teachers along the way. But nobody with any kind of regularity like I do with John, or I did with John. Week in, week out, every week, there I would be on the mat, go to retreats with him, go to weekends with him, for, 15, 20 years, I suppose.
What was the practice with him like in comparison to, say, Iyengar or Ashtanga or Shivananda? We all know these are kind of very signature styles. Someone comes for your class who studied, you can tell, oh, that's an Ashtanga person, that's an Iyengar person. Yeah. So what do you think were some of the kind of characteristics or distinguishing things about what you were doing with John?
So I'll try and sort of give you a flavor. Yeah. I was about to say always, but actually not always, often about our physical, anatomical body. So he might talk about the spine, or he might talk about how the thigh bone fits in, or how the cerebrospinal fluid works. So you would have a number of, or he might bring all the bones in and lay them out on the floor and say, look at this rib. And so you'd look at this rib, and then you'd do a whole class based on this rib, for instance. Yes,
that sounds like body Braybridge Cohen and body mind centering stuff. Exactly like that, right?
Yeah, I think, and I haven't worked with her, but I have an understanding of some of the people that have. So that kind of thing. But also then he would read a book, and he would come in and he would talk about, I remember for a couple of weeks, we were kind of dancing. We were doing all this kind of flicking around and swinging the hips and throwing the arms around and lassoing. And it was kind of crazy, like nothing you've ever done before. And then the next week we'd be sitting, and all we do all class was sit and think about the sacroiliac joint and how it hardly moves, but it does move. And if you move it a little bit, you might get a little bit of twist. So it was radically different. I wouldn't say each week, it would evolve, but, and in the beginning, when I very first started working with him, it was really strong work. We would do a lot of reaching and elongating and opening up. And I remember even one class we did the splits. This is a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Now, although I had a conversation with him the other day, so it might change. But the most recent classes I've been to him, which admittedly were a year or so ago, he was much more into talking about consciousness, and there would be very little.
I'm not surprised. Me too. Isn't that interesting? I guess we could get to that too. All right. So that's so interesting to me. So when in all of this mix do you start taking on the role of being a teacher? I began to teach just about at the time that I met John. Mm-hmm. So that was a kind of simultaneous thing. Mm-hmm. And when you started teaching, were you teaching kind of like John, or were you teaching other stuff?
Before I met him, I was basically as a cover teacher. So I would cover an Ashtanga class, and I would teach Ashtanga, and then I would cover a Shivananda class, and I would teach Shivananda.
Did you have to do any formal, did you have like a teacher training that you did or something that certified you or any of that kind of jazz back then?
I taught for a year, and then the legislation in the UK changed, and if you'd been teaching for 2 years, you didn't need a certificate.
There was a grandfather, I see.
Yeah. But I'd only been teaching for a year. Oh. So I didn't qualify. So I had to hightail it off to India and do a month's training in.
I see. You went to just an ashram somewhere and did that the month long. Gotcha.
I did. And that was a whole interesting experience.
Especially if you were doing other kind of stuff and then you had to go be in the ashram. That's a real switch.
It was a great experience though. It was a month long in the, and it was my first trip to India.
Yeah.
And
that in and of itself is a yoga lesson. It was for me, you know.
Yeah,
just experiencing time the way it is in India was like a lesson in consciousness.
And heat. And I was there in South India in April. So it was like monsoon in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And constantly soaked in sweat. You know, you'd come out of the shower and don't even bother to get dried because you just can't.
Yes.
So it was a physical experience. It was an emotional experience. It was totally, you know, up at 5 o'clock in the morning, to bed at 10 o'clock, silence. You know, it was fascinating and enriching in all kinds of ways.
Oh, I understand. I had a similar trip to India that shaped what I ended up doing down the road, but it took a little while. And it's interesting to me to hear your story because it does parallel in that, you know, you're intrigued by this other kinds of practices. That's where your heart is. And you even sheepishly said spiritual aspects or whatever before, that kind of where your heart is, where what brought you to it. But then you start to become a yoga teacher and there is kind of this evolution of it coming into the mainstream. And I think Iyengar and Ashtanga and even Shivananda, but those two especially became so popular because they were able to meld with fitness and other things in certain ways. And they weren't asking the same depth of inquiry that you were talking about. It. They weren't putting it on the student to have to kind of, here's the bones, figure it out. Or, you know what I mean? Like it was telling people, put your hand here, put your hand here. It's very concrete, clear postural instructions to give us markers for whether or not we're advanced or whatever, rather than the subtle inquiry into the nature of your existence and the qualitative reality that is. So it's interesting to me that a lot of us did spend some time teaching in that other way first. And it sounds like you started out there as well.
Yeah, simple economics. You know, if you wanted to teach yoga, you kind of had to do cover classes. There was no way, even back then, you know, you were kind of, I guess there weren't so many centers and it was difficult to get a job, you know, because it wasn't so mainstream back then. Mm-hmm. And you just had to kind of pick up the bits wherever you could. So,
right. Whoever did have the space or was kind of facilitating classes, oftentimes it was like a teacher of yours even, and then you were just kind of emulating whatever that teacher was doing.
Yeah, in the beginning. And then when I started going to John, I became a mini John. I think it's, you know, he was such a powerful and incredibly knowledgeable presence in my life. And the work was so meaningful that I couldn't do anything else other than teach what he had taught me. And after I'd been working with him for about a year, I suppose I started getting my own classes so I could do a bit more what I wanted to do. Mm. And yeah, it was unusual. And people used to walk out of class, you know, regularly. I would get 2 or 3 people who would walk out of class and I'd be going, oh.
That's right. Because people then at a certain point had an expectation about what was supposed to happen. And I know that I at first tried to do some things that were more like traditional Desikachar because it was coming from this one-to-one instruction place, but trying to offer that, people were like, what's this? And they would like write you off. So I actually did have to kind of create a class that looked more like what they would expect, or they might walk out, like you said.
Yeah. I mean, I think nowadays it's really interesting. Back then I was quite hardcore and I used to think, oh, screw them. They don't know what
I named my yoga center Abhyasa. And someone was like, why are you naming that? You should name it Williamsburg Yoga Center. So it's so less intimidating. I was like, no, I wanted to be intimidating. Like I wanted only people who weren't going to be intimidated by a Sanskrit word to come, But such a stupid thing. Nowadays I was like, oh, you're so dumb. You should have named it Williamsburg Yoga Center, dummy.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I think with age and experience, you realize you really need to meet people where they are.
Yeah. And you don't have so much to prove. See, because that's the thing. If there's a whole wave of power, fitness orientation yoga, and you're trying to carve out a space as a teacher to do something more subtle or simpler or gentle and not have it be bull or whatever, to have it be just as strong, you almost kind of had to get your back up at that time. I did. I wrote all these punk ass blog posts calling out all this stuff. You know what I mean? Like you kind of had to just to have confidence to assert it in a way. You had to feel like you had to fight back against this big monster or something. Although that is a lack of maturity. It's a lack of maturity for sure.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, also, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because now I don't compromise so much. I do recognize that, and it's lots and lots and lots.
What I want to get to with you, which is I think a conversation that I think you and I can have together, is a little bit about teacher training stuff. And I'm kind of getting us there because what I'm driving at is I know at some point for you, I believe I read it was like around 2004 where you're like, okay, this is what I'm going to teach, even if it isn't what the mainstream seems to be asking for. And I'm just kind of curious about that. Was that really like a clear, conscious choice you made? Was there a certain moment or experience where you're like, that's it. I'm not going to cover any Ashtanga or younger classes anymore. I'm only going to teach like this.
I think it was around the time that I was working with, around the time I met John.
Yeah.
I realized that this was much more powerful, much more intrinsically, it touched me much more deeply than anything else I'd done. And I thought this was the thing. And I thought, okay, in my classes, when I am allowed to do what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to teach. And then I taught that.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.